Isaiah, can you just unmute or something real quick and make sure you can hear us through the computer? I just want to hear if you can hear us through the computer.
Okay, speak.
Can you hear us?
Say it. Go again.
Can you hear me? Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Florentia, just so you know, we have a Google slide share. You can just escape and then or stop share and reshare yours. But I have your PDF open, so you can just move it to full screen when you're ready. You ready? Plug in. You go ahead.
Okay,
Just get full screen is right there. There you go. Yeah. Wow. Thank you everyone. I'm delighted here, and I'm, So it's wonderful. Thank you, Peter, for inviting and for this introduction. So what I wanted to share with you today is work that I'm doing with Jenna Nobles at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we're studying the impact of the pandemic on infant health at birth, right? And well, the pandemic started a while ago. And we are interested in this paper in understanding how the impact, if any, of the pandemic on birth outcomes has changed over time, if it has disappeared, if it has declined, or not. So I'm gonna give you kind of a broad introduction on what we have found. This comes from information from several papers, and then we're gonna move to the new stuff that includes data starting from at the beginning of the pandemic through December 2022. It's very recent data. We're getting, actually tomorrow we're getting data for the first trimester of 2023, but of course, I couldn't include that yet. Okay, so just as background, as we all know, the pandemic has had an unprecedented impact on population health, and this impact has been stratified by socioeconomic advantage, race and ethnicity, and other sources of vulnerability, right? An important and less visible consequence, its potential impact on health at birth. And that's what we're gonna be focusing on. If the impact is unequal, and it's likely that it is, it could contribute to health and well-being of the next generation and the intergenerational persistence of inequality. So as a scholar of stratification, this is what I'm gonna be considering in particular. We're gonna, there are of course many indicators of infant health. Preterm birth. The reason is that preterm birth is a leading cause of infant mortality and morbidity, and among surviving infants is a determinant of individual development and well-being throughout the entire life course. And there's a growing scholarship documented that those associations. When the pandemic started, experts predicted predicted an increase in preterm birth resulting from the pandemic. However, when the first studies starting to emerge across affluent countries, they found a surprising decline in preterm birth attributable to the pandemic. You see this on your left. You see this in the New York Times during the coronavirus lockdowns. Some doctors wonder, where are the preemies, right? That was the NICUs, the neonatal ICUs were empty, and people started noticing this phenomenon, and this was written in several papers. This idea, everyone actually attributed any decline in preterm birth to the policy response to the pandemic, the lockdowns. That was the hypothesis. And as I just mentioned, people speculated that this good news, right, the decline amidst a very widespread crisis, some good news in terms of the decline in preterm birth, where it was attributed to a work and commute related reduction in work and commute related strain and stress among pregnant persons, increased opportunities to exercise, to sleep at home, reduced exposure to other infections, particularly the flu, decline in air pollution, and the disruption of obstetric services. All these hypotheses were offered. Till now, we don't know it emerged. These explanations are all reasonable, but they contrast with well-documented increases attributed to the pandemic in well-established determinants of preterm birth, such as increased stress and anxiety among pregnant people. And we know there's a well-established connection between anxiety during pregnancy and infant health. This puzzle, of course, suggests multiple pathways of influence, right, in the effect of the pandemic, and heterogeneity in its effects across the population. It also calls for analysis of trends over time as the pandemic environment has changed so dramatically. And that's what we're gonna tackle here. Okay, so let me say a word about these three items that we are tackling. First, in terms of multiple pathways, at very least, one would like to distinguish a direct pathway that is driven by the COVID infection itself among the pregnant people, from indirect pathways, right? Driven by economic disruption, stress and anxiety, access to healthcare, and many other factors. So at very least, we want to, if possible, determine if there's these two pathways are operating. In terms of heterogeneity across the population, the effect, based on theory, the effect of COVID could be negative for some groups, plausibly disadvantaged groups, and neutral or even positive for more advantaged populations. And these are, there are many theoretical approaches. This kind of heterogeneity, including the fundamental cause approach. I'm not going to get into details. I'm happy to talk more about this later. The cumulative disadvantage approach, right, among others. Third, we have multiple pathways, we have heterogeneity, we have change over time in the impact of the pandemic. The epidemiologic, economic, institutional context has transformed dramatically over these last 3 years, and in many ways that may shape how the pandemic is affecting health and the health of the pregnant population, and who is having babies. All right, so everything I said sounds reasonable to anyone, but it's very hard to study, in large part because of data constraint, right? Ideally, we would like to rely on population level data with no selectivity and detailed and timely information. Like if I was the queen, I wanted this to do my research. But in the US, the natality data are released annually with a lag of several months. And with coarsening, even if you get the restricted access file, you are going to get coarsening of key measures such as detailed location and birth time. That wasn't sufficient for our purposes, that is Jenna Nobles and mine. And so to address this issue, what we did was to go directly to the states. So state by state, we're still acquiring restricted access, continuous release information on births, right? We started requesting data from 2014 to have data pre the occurrence of the pandemic. And we're doing this, like I mentioned, we're getting quarterly files. Did you pause and say, I don't know what the culture is, the norms are here. You have oh, okay. I kind of present to economists on a regular basis, so if I don't get on a slide, I'm feeling like no one is paying attention. No, this is great. At least if you have clarification questions, yeah. So anything at this point? Okay. So that's what led us to the question, and that's the way we're gonna do it. We're gonna get state level data that's given to us on a regular basis. So with that in hand, we're gonna examine population level consequences of COVID on infant health, considering these three dimensions that I mentioned, right? Socioeconomic heterogeneity, pathways of influence and change over time. We're gonna focus on this exercise on California, because it's a state that has all the kinds of data that we require. It's also, in substantive terms, is a large state, right? And socioeconomically, ethno-racially diverse. And California birth records began including information on the COVID infection status of all persons giving birth at the time of delivery as early as June 2020. So every person giving birth, or virtually, I should say, was given a COVID test when they were gonna have that. And the data also allow us to identify siblings. So that is births of the same person, okay? Which is very important for our purposes. Okay, so we're gonna first evaluate population level trends in preterm birth during the pandemic. Then we're gonna move to this, we're gonna examine the direct role of COVID infection during pregnancy. Third, we're gonna evaluate the change over time in the impact of COVID infection on infant health, with a particular emphasis when we're considering change over time in the plausible role of vaccination, because that has a relevant, potentially relevant policy implication. Okay, this is just trends in a COVID infection. Okay, so starting in June 2020, which is when we started measuring, this is among all persons giving birth, is the dotted line. And then for, as a baseline, if you will, for the entire California population, that's the solid line. You see the Delta surge, right? In the winter of 2020 to 2021, and then the massive Omicron surge later on. You see that the two lines are quite consistent with each other. That gives us some source of reassurance that our measure of COVID infection during pregnancy aligns with population patterns, and the prevalence is much higher for the pregnant population because everyone is there, right? So this is universal test, or PAS. Everyone, when they go to the birthing centers and they test. All right, so this is just information. So let's move to the first part of the analysis, which is the population level impact of COVID as in the COVID pandemic. This is a historical phenomenon, not COVID infection yet, one of the pathways, on preterm birth. We're gonna do a time series analysis using ARIMA, not very common in sociology, ARIMA models, but they're, they're good for the job, to analyze time series data. And we use those to account for the marked autocorrelation in this kind of birth and seasonality and other sources of autocorrelation. The time of the so-called intervention is March 2020, when the shelter-in-place order. And this is the raw data. This is just the raw data. So what we have here is by calendar week of birth. We did everything using week of conception, which might be even more adequate, but the results are identical. So I'm gonna keep it simple. So by week of birth, we have the proportion of preterm births in California for that week. Every circle is a week, and I fit it like a nonlinear lowest, right? And the vertical line is March 2020. And what you see here in the raw data, you see the marked seasonality of preterm birth. It's pretty noticeable, right? But you also see that soon after the pandemic, in the early pandemic, there may have been a decline in preterm births compared to a pre-treatment trend, right? And then there may have been an increase in preterm birth, and then there may have been a return to baseline. That's why we have statistical analysis, right? But this gives you kind of a raw sense of the data we're using for this part of the analysis. So these are the results of the analysis. What I'm showing to you here is over time, over a period of time, right? Starting in March, July 2020, all the way to August, December 2022, which is the last time of observation at this point. We're gonna show you, and the zero line means no change compared to the past trends. So we're using the past to predict the future, right? The past is a counterfactual, and then if what we observe significantly departs from what we would expect based on the past, then the estimate is significantly different from zero. So what you see here is very consistent with prior research. Early on in the pandemic, there's a decline in preterm birth by about 0.7 percentage points. You say, is this large, more substantively? Well, the preterm birth rate is about 8%, 0.7, almost a percentage point is not irrelevant at all. And depending, of course, on the population size, that means a lot of babies that wouldn't have been born preterm if the pandemic, that would have been born preterm, but didn't if the pandemic had not occurred. That's the strongest causal interpretation. Okay, so consistent with the past, good news early on in the pandemic, decline in preterm birth, but then there's an increase in preterm birth that coincides with the Delta surge of infections. And then there's a return to baseline, no departure from from what would be predicted from the past. This is an aggregate population. Then you say, well, this might be all about the composition of the persons giving birth post-pandemic. So we're accounting for all sorts of socio-demographic factors, attributes of the persons giving birth, and we find exactly the same. Then you say, this might be a story about obstetric practice, right? So we're accounting in the third set of estimates for whether the birth is a cesarean section or an induction of labor. That's the literature suggests that those things may have changed, and we find pretty much the same. This is not a story about composition, not solely a story about composition or obstetric practice. All right, this is what we need to explain. Let me move from trends to the stratification of trends, right? And put my kind of stratification scholar hat. The way in which I'm gonna measure socioeconomic advantage here is by the birthing person educational attainment. And I'm gonna distinguish three groups, right? High school or less, some college, BA or more. Yes. This one? Oh, the Omicron surge later on, you mean? Or much later on here in early 2022. That's the winter from 21 to 22, basically, when Omicron became prevalent. So it would be this period in which you see an increase, but it's not, different from zero. Okay. But this early surge is Delta. This is pre-vaccines, basically. Or the vaccines were starting to be released in the spring of 2021. Doesn't it sound like Asian history? All this is at the same time so recent and so kind of remote. It's interesting. In any case, so this is for the entire population, but let's move to the stratification of this effect if you believe that this could be an effect. Of course, I'm not talking about mechanisms here. I'm just saying there's a change of post-pandemic compared with the prediction from the past. But this is the most striking thing for me. I cannot get over this still. I'm showing you trends by stratified by educational attainment. So high school or less, the darker purple, some college, and then BA or more with the tenuous purple. I don't know. So this is really easy to summarize. The early pandemic gains in preterm birth were mostly captured by advantaged populations. The Delta surge and follow-up losses of the pandemic, driven most likely by infection, were concentrated among the disadvantaged populations, with no significant positive effect early in the pandemic for disadvantaged population, and no significant negative effect during the Delta times for more advantaged populations. I really don't want to own this graph because of this Gelman, and the Gelman statistician think like significant effects might not be significantly different from each other. You see that the confidence intervals overlap somehow, but this to me is quite suggestive that there is stratification in the impact. Okay, this is about the stratification question. Then, yes. Not at all. This is a very good point. So we are including the entire population and just breaking it down by educational attainment, nothing else. Exactly. We know, however, that the probability of, I'm going to show you, I may show you later, the probability of infection varies dramatically by SES, right? I'm going to show you later, yes. Okay, so we pause here for a second and say, well, are these patterns in any way idiosyncratic? Is this a California story in any way that has to do with population composition, responses, institutional responses, whatever it is? So very quickly, I'm gonna rely on New Jersey data and show you, I'm gonna do the same exercise for New Jersey, the same as you just seen. So except that I have data through 2021, we just got the file for 2022, but it's not ready yet. And I'm gonna do the same for the entire population, what happened in terms of preterm birth, and you see something similar. There's a decline, good news, in preterm birth early in the pandemic in 2020. And the magnitude is, well, we have a confidence interval, but in any case, it doesn't depart. And then it returned to baseline. We don't see an increase in preterm birth later on in the pandemic as in California. And when we repeat our question about stratification, these are controlling for everything else, we see the same. And when we repeat our analysis of stratification, we get, again, for a stratification scholar, something that's tremendously troublesome, which is we do find substantial evidence of stratification. Early on in the pandemic, there is a negative effect only among the most disadvantaged birthing people. But it was very early on. It was March, July 2020, which was a very shocking until we realized that in the state of New Jersey, COVID, the first surge in infections was extremely early, even before we knew that COVID was going around, right? So a plausible explanation is that individuals who got first infected, I'm talking about the first few months, it's not the were low disadvantaged. right? For all the reasons that have been much discussed in media and so on. So we claim that the timing of the impact of COVID if it was driven by infection itself, right? Infection among the pregnant people is different, but the stratification still manifests itself, right? Okay, so moving on to the next step, to take stock, the impact of COVID on infant health appears to be profoundly stratified. Advantaged populations appear to have benefit from positive externalities of the early policy responses to the pandemic. That's plausible, right? Staying home, having a little bit more time, not being exposed to other infections. Whereas disadvantaged populations endure negative consequences of infection. This matters tremendously, I think, because the COVID pandemic is expected to exacerbate inequality in multiple ways. These findings suggest a very enduring pathway, which is the legacy of prenatal exposure to a very unequal pandemic environment, with widely unequal exposure to infection itself. And we also learned that a critical mechanism from both the main effect and stratification of the effect of the pandemic on infant health appears to be COVID infection during pregnancy, so the direct effect itself, right? So we can and we will examine that mechanism for the California case because we have this universal test, right? At the time of delivery of all people giving birth. Okay, so I'm gonna move to that. That's kind of the last part of the analysis. Here, I'm giving you, showing you estimates of the effect of COVID infection during pregnancy on the probability of preterm birth. And I'm showing you the difference in means, right? So, or in probability, the proportion. So in the dot at the bottom, and this dot does have a confidence interval. It's very narrow, but it does have it. So this is the probability of preterm birth for non-infecting birthing persons, which is about 7.3%. But among COVID-infected persons, like 3% of the sample, it's almost 9%. This is huge. It's a, say, 1.5 percentage points. But that means, depending again on the population, the more the denominator, as they should, this is a lot of births, right? That were maybe. This is in a model that doesn't include any controls. This is the model, and we only control for time fixed effects, like month fixed effects, and birthing facility fixed effects in procedures, policies, and obstetric practices, and so on, nothing else. Let's see if this effect, let's scrutinize this effect. We add controls, socio-demographic controls, characteristics of the persons giving birth, and the estimate keeps, quite unchanged. We add risk factors, things that really predict preterm birth, including, in particular, prior preterm birth. The main predictor of preterm birth today is if the person has had a prior preterm birth. We include the different risk factors. We find the same. You still might not be, this is after all just a cross-sectional, your multivariate model. You might not be convinced that this is a real effect of COVID infection. It might be selectivity. I agree with you. So we move to sibling fixed effects using a linked birth by person giving birth. And I teach causal inference. I'm not gonna claim that this is a causal estimate, but in my humble opinion, pretty good, to put it very, formally. So using mother fixed effects, so comparing births of the same mothers, we have that if you believe that this might approach a causal effect, that the pandemic, that COVID infection increases the risk of preterm birth by about 1.5%. 1.5%. That is huge. Like if we pause for a second and consider the impact of diverse harmful exposures, like I've studied wars, things like that. this is much bigger than, you know, what the literature would the estimates the literature would give. Then you have in kind, and you haven't stopped me and say, well, I don't trust this very much, but you know, I'm claiming that every pregnant person was, but you know, universal testing practices, protocols may have changed over time. So we call, well, a research assistant called every birthing facility in California, and they ascertained by phone when the universal testing of birthing persons started, and if it ended. So we restricted our sample to only facilities with universal testing when the birth occurred. We find the same. You may be thinking that this is an unfair comparison because the treated siblings are, for the most part, a higher parity and younger than control siblings, right? Thank you. I know, you know, the economists are saying, oh, what are you? So we did a little placebo. We did plenty of placebos. I'm happy to tell you about falsification tests, in which we randomly selected, you know, younger siblings with the time of birth distribution identical to the treated kids, and we consistently found nothing. So that provides some reassurance that this is a true effect. That in the end, I'm not very humble, but you know, I've been working on this for a while. I think, frankly, that this provides the best estimate available to date on the impact of COVID infection on infants. Okay, so to summarize, well, very strong association between maternal COVID infection and preterm birth. The association is plausibly causal, and empirically it's probably the best we could do at this point, although you may have ideas. But last part of the presentation, this association that I've shown you, this one, captures patterns from July 2020, which is when COVID infection started to be measured among birthing people, to December 2022. And of course, things have changed dramatically, right? We have seen the emergence and decline of different variants with different levels of virulence. We have seen the emergence of vaccination, therapeutic alternatives, and so on. So in the last piece, I want to examine that. This association may have declined as new variants emerge, particularly Omicron is a milder variant, and as vaccines and therapeutic alternatives become available. And frankly, we cannot do yet everything or much of what we would like to do on this, but I'm going to show you kind of preliminary analysis. Okay, so we're gonna, thinking that the sibling fixed effects models may provide an estimate that everything I'm showing you from now on is all based on sibling fixed effects, okay? No more cross-sectional analysis. And what we're going to do is over time, from July 2020 through December 2022 in like a quarter intervals, I'm gonna show you how this association between COVID infection during pregnancy and preterm birth has changed, okay? And this is what we find. Again, the solid dots is the probability of preterm birth among non-COVID infected birthing people, and the white circle is the probability among COVID infected people. And you see at the beginning of the pandemic, a very large impact of the pandemic, more than 3 percentage points. It's unbelievable. Well, it's large. It's not necessarily unbelievable. You know, we were not prepared. There was any possible response to the pandemic. The protocols may have not supported these births, and so on and so forth. Or part of this may have been driven by premature cesarean sections or induction of labor, right, in order to reduce the risk to the birthing person or in the hospital setting. But be it as it may, this is a very large effect. And then you see a negative effect that persists, widens in the spring of 2021. This is the Delta surge again, and disappears starting in May 2022, right? So substantial variation. So to your question, Sarah, I'm missing the February 22 to May, but you see the disappearance. Apologies, I don't know what. When Omicron was prevalent, there's, even if the rate of infection was high, there's no effect, no association between birthing person infection and preterm birth anymore. So massive change over time, and a certain sense that the effect may have declined quite substantially, right? It's like as if we had, this is exactly and again, we can do very little about that at the moment, but we're going to be able to really tackle these when we're requesting individual level immunization data for the state of California, and then we're going to be able to link and really answer that question. For now, it's all an ecological association that we're getting. Okay, so so let's go to that. Heather, a question with relevant policy implications is the role of vaccines in reducing the harmful impact of COVID infection during pregnancy on infant health, right? And this is just descriptive. This is your question: is the vaccine uptake in California? This is not among pregnant people. This is for everyone. We don't know yet. You know, we have some differences by age only. So, well, as you see in early 2021, it was 0, because in the spring of 2021 was when vaccines became available to all individuals 16 and older. And then the uptake is quite, you know, rapid and increases through through the spring of 2022. What I'm showing you, this curve, is the proportion of the population with what is considered even now complete vaccination, which is 2 doses or 1 if it's Johnson & Johnson, okay? And then it plateaus very remarkably. In the spring of 2022, that was it. Unfortunately, I mean, it's about 2/3, right? And that there's a significant plateau. As I mentioned, at the moment, we don't have individual level information on vaccination. We will. The only thing we have, the more detailed information we do have, is by zip code. That's the best we can do at the moment. Perfect. Wow, I rushed so much, and now it's we can talk about something else and return or not. So this is for the entire California population. And then, so what we're gonna do here is we're gonna stratify our sample of by quintile of vaccination uptake. So 5 equal size groups of zip codes, well, population weighted, of course. So it's the 5 population weighted quintile, well, isn't that redundant? Quintiles of population, where what defines the quintile is the proportion of the population that is fully vaccinated, okay? And when we do that, we have a enormous variance, of course, because that's a variable I used to define the quintile. So at the bottom, the zip codes with the lowest vaccination uptake, they plateau at a rate of 50%. So half of the population is vaccinated at tops, right? Whereas at at the top, so in the most highly vaccinated quintile, areas such as, where I live in Palo Alto, right? The vaccination rate approached 90%. So, close to universality, right? And there are 3 quintiles, look, they're in the middle. So as a first step to address your question, Heather, what we're gonna do is we're gonna evaluate these trends in the impact of COVID infection during pregnancy on preterm birth across quintiles, right? The bottom quintile, the lowest vaccination rate quintile, and the top, approach universality. This doesn't include boosters yet at all. And this is what we find. This is the top quintile, the Palo Altos of California, right? Where most everyone got vaccinated. And you see, early on in the pandemic, and this is important, through the spring of 2021, there is a substantial and large impact of COVID infection on preterm birth, which makes sense if you believe that the vaccine did something because the vaccines were not available. But immediately after that, so starting in May 2021, you see that the impact of COVID on preterm birth it's not significantly different from Z. Let me contrast this with the lowest vaccination rate quintiles at the zip codes, right? And you see a pattern that is strikingly different. You see, well, in the first 2 time points through the spring of 2021, you see virtually very similar effects of COVID infection during pregnancy. But after that, in this the lowest vaccination areas of California, zip codes of California, you see still a very large impact, negative impact. That is, COVID infection keeps having a negative impact, increasing the probability of preterm birth. But towards the end of 2022, you see a closing of the gap, regardless, suggesting that suggesting many things, but for now, you see a striking difference in patterns that is consistent with the claim that vaccinations substantially help in reducing the negative, harmful impact of COVID infection on preterm birth. So let me wrap up So the COVID pandemic has had a substantive impact on infant health. This impact has been markedly stratified, has changed over time, has been driven to a large extent by a COVID infection in pregnancy. That kind of addresses the 3 questions that I outlined in the beginning. This is the area that is more tentative. The harmful impact has declined. This harmful impact has declined over time to fully disappear in the second half of 2020. And this is quite tentative. Vaccination has likely contributed to reduce this harmful impact. So with that, thank you so much. And important question. Well, and so Sorry, thank you. Such an important point. No, the only, this has several implications that perhaps drive. So let's walk through this a little bit because we have been thinking quite a bit on that. So let's go. And as far as we know, there's no population level data that would give you that with any level of completeness, right? That's why part of our claim here is that we are long overdue for a cohort study in which you follow individuals starting before. I don't think I need to make the case here, but so the answer, the first and easy answer is no. The second important answer is, why does that matter? The second important question, I'm sorry. The way we see that now is that if there, first off, many pregnant individuals may have had COVID earlier in the pregnancy, right? In that case, and that needs to be the case. If that is, for those individuals that this is the case, early pregnancy COVID infection most likely would be a confounder that would render our estimates a lower bound. That is the case because early pregnancy COVID infection at the same time may very likely do nothing or increase the chances of preterm birth. There's the monotonicity, I think, is safe here. I don't think early pregnancy COVID infection will reduce the chances of preterm birth, even if there's massive selectivity in utero, and I don't think that's possible. We could say that with some certainty. So this confounder increases the chances of preterm birth, but decreases the chances that the individual tests positive at delivery, because having 2 consecutive COVID infections in such a short period of time is very unlikely. If that holds, then we are giving you an underestimate. Is that enough? No, but we can bound and so on. But so far, kind of that's where we are, if that makes sense. Oh well, you're monitoring. Yes, no, you didn't present. I didn't present anything about age. We examine the individual. First, the probability of an infection, because this is all based on everything we have done. It seems to be the case that after a very in which there were positive externalities of the policy responses to COVID that benefited advantaged populations. After that, when no one was yet getting COVID, by in March, April, when we were in lockdown, and then some people, advantaged people benefited, then the main mechanism is COVID infection itself among pregnant. So given that, we examine in this other paper the factors shaping the probability of getting infected and age among them. And then whether the impact of COVID infection varies by those. You see what I'm saying? So in terms of the former, you have, not unsurprisingly perhaps, that younger pregnant populations are more likely to get infected. But in terms of the latter, we find no association between the age of that infected person and the outcome. And interestingly, if I could build on your question, we find that similar lack of association in the connection between infection and outcomes, that is preterm birth, across SES and race ethnicity, which is quite striking to us. We were expecting the opposite. We were expecting that more disadvantaged individuals would be more highly hit by the same infection, right? Because of comorbidities, different treatment by the medical, by the healthcare system, and we didn't find any of them. Definitely, you have to be observed the live birth. So two such important questions. In terms of asymptomatic infections, the only data we have on infection is whether there's a positive test. So we cannot identify symptoms. We try consequences of COVID infection on the person giving birth, that are included in the birth certificate, such as a fever, administration of, well, antibiotics, it wasn't, and so on and so forth, right? We didn't go down that path because the validity of those measures in the birth certificate is extremely doubtful, you know, so we just didn't do anything with that. Beyond that, we don't know at the moment. Okay, let me pause here. Second, miscarriages, that's a very important question. The broader question is, of course, selectivity in utero, right? Which ones of those conceptions do get reobserved? Whether in particular, if I could push your question, maybe you had this in mind, but a critical concern is whether a COVID infection early in the pregnancy resulted in the loss of the pregnancy, right? We don't know for sure, because many of the pregnancy losses that occur earlier go unrecorded and then unnoticed by the pregnant person. Pregnant person might not even know that that they are pregnant, right? So we use the fetal death file that when there is viability after week 24, and we didn't find any substantial effect, but that's not adjudicated, because most likely if the pregnancy is going to be lost, it's going to happen earlier. So we did a few indirect tests that people use in the literature, for example, that is speaking Spanish here. For example, change in the secondary sex birth ratio. Many scholars have claimed that male gestations are more frail, so if there is some shock, right, you would see a change in this in the male to female birth rate. Another secondary, or if you observe a change in the variance of outcomes at birth and so on and so forth, those secondary tests suggest that selectivity in utero wasn't a big phenomenon here. That's actually more or less consistent with the evidence. The problem with the evidence, I mean, there's so much valuable evidence, but it's hard to take stock because most of the studies in the medical literature are wonderful. Don't get me wrong, I really appreciate them, but they consider one hospital for a couple months, so it's hard to kind of take stock, but I would say to the extent that there is consistency in the literature, I think the research community suggests that selection in utero shouldn't be a big issue here. No, unfortunately, we cannot do that yet because we don't have individual level information on vaccination at all. The only thing we have at the moment is aggregate information of vaccination at the zip code level. That's the most detailed unit of analysis for vaccination at the moment. But we are engaged in the long and painful process of getting those data from the California Department of Public Health, which is an outstanding, it's amazing. Until you get to interact with these institutions, you know how many wonderful professionals are there curating the data and so on. But they, with all due reason, want to make sure that the data are used well, because it's very sensitive, right? You have identifying information of, so those data, I'm going to be able to address that question, but not yet, unfortunately. That one? Not really. Oh, the aggregate analysis. Yep, got it. Before certification, so that's over time for everyone. We're not analyzing infection itself. Yes. Oh, you mean that the confidence intervals look wider and wider? Yeah. There's a reason that makes it harder and harder to estimate anything as you push forward, which is that we're using a past to predict the future. So the further in the future you go, the more uncertainty there is. I'm putting it a little loosely. I know that this plays, like you do statistics seriously, but I hope statisticians don't disagree with that, right? They were forecasting, and therefore uncertainty associated with forecasting. So as we move forward into the future, that's going to increase that uncertainty coming from that. Sure. Or this is no controls, or the stratification. Oh, sure, that one. So that's exactly right. The point estimate, if you didn't have a confidence interval, you would say that for the high school or less birthing people, there was a decline of about 0.5 percentage point in the probability of preterm birth. But of course, that's not significantly different from zero, right? So yeah. We cannot claim with certainty, if you believe in this, frequentist approach, that there could be an. Thank you.